We're on the brand new parkway, Palmetto Commerce Parkway, that is, that connects Ashley Phosphate and Latson Road. It's a beautiful place, and it's got all sorts of natural things here, birds and wetlands and all of that, and it's got quite a bit of history as well. And so we thought we'd ask Ed Schmale, and he is an environmental scientist, and he's working with the RoadWise program, the Transportation Half-Cent Sales Tax program, and he's going to explain to us why it's so important to do something that they call mitigate on projects. Welcome to our program.
All right, thank you, Cheryl.
When we talk about mitigate, and I'm talking about wetlands, I'm talking about birds, do they go together in road building business?
Yes, throughout our project development process, there are all certain categories of impacts that we have to address, and each resource has a governmental agency that watches over and protects that resource and has jurisdiction over it. And if the impacts are significant enough, they may require those impacts to be mitigated.
So would you say that in building these roads, and not only here in Charleston County with the RoadWise program or the Transportation Sales Tax program, but all over our state and probably all over the country, these types of agencies are concerned about the environment. Is that true?
Correct. Whether you're talking about wetlands or cultural resources or endangered species, all those resources are exhausted during the project development process, and until a project can be built, we need to get certain permits and approvals, and those approvals may include mitigation for impacts of those resources. Using this project as an example, when we first came out here, it was just woods, and now there's a wonderful highway. How did you, and what was done to mitigate this area? Well, when we first started this project, we of course first would go and do some high-level analysis, looking at mapping over the internet and through GIS systems, and then we came out and did field work where we come out and we actually survey the limits of wetlands and look for threatened and endangered species. And throughout that process, we also hired a cultural resources subconsultant who found some pretty interesting resources on this project.
And once you find those resources, then is that when the mitigation comes in? You need to do something about it, especially if you're going to use some of the property or the land that is in the area of a historic site or a wetland or something like that?
Yes, normally you need to follow what the EPA defines as the three-tier hierarchy, which is to avoid, minimize, and then mitigate. So first you have to make sure that the resource can't be completely avoided. Then second, you have to minimize the impact as much as possible. And then thirdly, if the impact cannot be avoided and minimized, then you have to provide the mitigation.
That's something I want to go into for just a second with you. And that has to do with the early stages of this project or any other project that's being done under the half-cent sales tax, where someone has to decide, we need to take a look at this project and make sure, I imagine this is in the design stage, I don't know, and make sure that we're not interrupting anything of nature. And if we do, then we've got to do something about it, positive.
Yeah, prior to when we normally would start a project, we'll send out letters to the federal and state and local agencies who have expertise in their area, and they will normally send us a response saying that they know of a certain resource in the area, and then we'll go out and do more detailed studies on that.
Are you telling me that the agencies, I think there are about 12 or more, that you have to send, meaning those responsible for the project, have to send some sort of information letting them know that you're about to work in this area? They know, do they know, all of them, do they know this state that well that they can tell you where you're getting ready to go under the design is a place that is natural or historic or what have you?
Not to a survey level of detail, but there is a lot of existing information out there that can give you an idea as to what resources you're going to have to deal with when you get down into the design process.
Now, what was done here at Palmetto Commerce Parkway?
Well, on this project, we had to submit a wetland permit for wetland impacts, and as part of that process, the Army Corps of Engineers has to consult with the the State Historic Resource Office, and through that process and the surveys, we identified the historic rice plantation that used to exist on this site.
Oh, I know. And the mitigation for that is awesome. And we're not going to tell you right now what was done because we want you just to know about mitigation. But certainly a fabulous project came out of the mitigation for the Palmetto Commerce Parkway. And we're going to be sharing that with the entire community here in the very, very near future. And you know all about it, but I'm not going to tell it right now. Now, when you deal with each of these agencies, and you've notified them that we're getting ready to do this project, the design of this project says we're going to have to take a piece of something that maybe the community considers important, do all of them respond to you? Or just a few, or how is that done?
Usually it's just a lot of times the agency will tell you that they don't know of anything, or, usually you do get some sort of response.
What do you get the most of, especially in an area like Charleston, where there's lots of water, lots of wetlands, marshes, birds, everything you can think of that's a part of nature?
Yeah, certainly in Charleston, wetlands is probably the biggest thing that we deal with on our projects from a day-to-day basis, and being that Charleston is as historic of an area as it is, cultural resources is also a big part of our investigations.
I would think so. And then I noticed that on that list also there was a organization that has to be contacted like the others do, the Army Corps of Engineers and all the rest, that has to do with socioeconomic groups. What's that all about?
Well, as part of the NEPA process, which is for federally funded projects, you also have to look at impacts to socioeconomics and environmental justice, and impacts to not only the natural environment, but what we refer to as the human environment.
Now, I'm not going to go too far on this, but I'm interested in some of the other ways that you have been familiar with that the project developers, meaning the people who are putting together the road or the highway or the bridge, what are some of the other things you've run into?
Well, sometimes you never know what you're going to run into. You may come across a hazardous material site. We've run into those on projects. Maybe you come across a cemetery that no one knew about, or there's an old house back in the woods that people forgot was back there that turns out to be a historic site, or you may come across endangered species, or sometimes you never know what's going to come up. It's always something.
The State Archives, it's always concerned about history and the history of South Carolina and certainly Charleston County. How often do they get involved in these kinds of things? I would think a lot.
Yeah, they're normally involved on most of our projects, at least in the beginning, just to check their records and see if anything is known in the area. Sometimes it's if it's just a small intersection project, it's fairly easy to tell if there's going to be impacts or not. But on a project of this size, where you're cutting through an area that is just wooded, that's going to take a lot more investigation to determine what's out there.
And when this comes to the point where something's got to happen to improve the land around a project or the land around a proposed project, once you get to that point, is there any turning back? In other words, can you redesign the project and go in another direction, or have you tested all those things?
Well, normally we start out with sort of conceptual alignments or corridors. I know on this particular project we had, a handful of different alignments that we looked at, and you start on a high level of those alignments, and you try to whittle it down to one that minimizes impacts as much as possible, and you have to try to balance, avoiding one impact to impact another resource. And once you get down to that design phase, when you've chosen what seems to be the best alignment, then you can work with the engineers and designers to put tweaks into a project to minimize impacts even further.
Have the engineers, the designers, have they ever said in your career, in the history of your career, that we can't do it? It's just going to have to go through this graveyard, and that's that?
Well, sometimes the engineering end of things has certain design standards they need to meet with the State Department, and certain engineering standards through all their guidebooks, and sometimes those standards may preclude a moving an alignment or making a certain adjustment to the design where that standard can't be violated to miss a resource.
So are you telling me that when you come up upon a historic piece of land or something that's a part of your whole line or whole list of agencies that want to make sure that we take care of the environment, that the designers are going to find some kind of way to do that? I mean, they never say no to these agencies?
Well, you know, sometimes you come across something that's just, you know, may actually kill a project if it's significant enough of a resource. But usually we come to a point where, you know, we work with the agencies and the engineers and try to come up with a plan that minimizes the impact as much as possible and offsets that impact with mitigation.
There have been a series of public meetings long before you get to the point where you start building, and all sorts of alternatives are provided. And I'm sure that you look at each of these alternatives to decide whether or not they're going to require more or less mitigation. Is that true? And whichever one has less, is that the one you're going to choose, or are there other considerations?
You know, usually you will take your alternatives and put them into a table and compare your impacts. And, you know, sometimes impacts, you know, wetland impacts to natural resources are more quantifiable from a money and number standpoint, but you know, the economic and human impacts aren't always it's not as easy to put a number on that. So sometimes avoiding impacts to a neighborhood or a community may outweigh impacting a wetland. It's just something you have to compare on a project to project basis.
Well, I imagine that's pretty hard to do. And on top of all of this, I mentioned those 12 agencies that have to be contacted when you're getting ready to build a project like this, and they have their say, they have their input, but there are also conservation organizations throughout the community, and I'm sure in other parts of South Carolina. How do you address that when they say you don't need to go through there, it needs to be left alone?
Well, we try to work with certain groups and try to bring them into the process when we can, and usually during the course of a project, you know, responses will be submitted to us when a project goes out on public notice or through public meetings, and we'll have to work to provide a response to those comments. Yeah,
I mentioned public meetings. When each of the agencies, Army Corps of Engineers or SHPO, meaning the State Archives, any of those organizations get hold of information about an oncoming project and they respond to you, do they always have the answer, or they expect you to come up with the answer?
Well, you know, they're just giving us guidance as to what, you know, they think may be out there. You know, the burden of proof is on the client, in this case, which would be Charleston County, to show that, you know, we've done the level of investigation necessary to show what's out there, and through the process we have avoided and minimize the impacts to those resources as best that we could.
We talked about public meetings where folks have a chance to decide which alternative they think that the road builders ought to take. Once these agencies, the ones that I just named earlier, get the information that a road is about to be built near something that's of concern or importance to them, is there another public hearing?
Yes, there's opportunities for public hearings. If you're going to follow the NEPA process for a federally funded project, you're going to have public involvement in that stage. And then also, once you submit your wetland permits, there also will be another opportunity for public comment and another opportunity for a possible public hearing.
And there's no go until all that's satisfied.
Correct. You know, that there has to be, you know, at the end of the project process, you know, all the comments have to be satisfied to whichever federal agency has approval on that project for our stage of the process.
Thank you so much, Ed Schmale, who is an environmental engineer, and he is working with the RoadWise program, or the Charleston County Transportation Half-Cent Sales Tax. Now we want to go to Patrice Smith, who's going to meet one of those agencies that I keep naming. It's the Army Corps of Engineers. We'll be back in just a moment, and we'll hear from her.